Okay, so we're talking about the mind-muscle connection because it can actually impact your training. When we're talking about the mind-muscle connection, most of the time, people are referring to the ability to increase a muscle's activity simply by really focusing on contracting the muscle harder or maybe longer during a weight training set. Now, of course, this may be reasonable if someone's having a difficult time recruiting a muscle or muscle group. It's used in rehabilitation all the time for a reason, but that's not the whole story. We've got to cover the strength and conditioning and performance part of this to really complete the story. So while focusing on the mind-muscle connection may lead to a larger electrical signal of a muscle, it can also decrease your performance. For example, many studies have shown that adopting this focus when weight training decreases the forces people are able to apply. This has been observed in both single joint, like a biceps curl, and multi-joint exercises, like a bench press. So let's stick with the bench press. If I give you a cue to focus on contracting your pec, you're probably going to increase the electrical signal to that pec, which again may be meaningful. This is called muscle excitation. But when this happens, placing this extra demand on the pec will lead to a decrease in the weight you're able to lift, or a decrease in the reps you're able to lift with the same load. So it's going to decrease your force output. There also seems to be limitations on how much we can increase this muscle signal. Studies suggest improvements are really only seen early in the weight training set, say the first 2 to 3 reps, but not really after that. So this tells us that when fatigue starts to set in, as we start to get to exhaustion, that's a much larger player in the muscle's recruitment pattern than just focusing on than added focused attention to the muscle itself. Another observation from scientists that study this is that cueing this added attention to the muscle only seems to enhance that signal with lower intensity loads, specifically 20 to 60% of 1 rep max. So when loads increase beyond 60% of 1 rep max, these focus-driven muscle improvements and neural signals seem to go away. Now, if we look at our research on motor control, training this mind-muscle connection would be called an internal focus of attention. Why does this matter? Well, it's well established now, and within that body of evidence, that using an external focus, so not internal, is a superior training method when learning a new motor skill. So if we go back to the bench press again, if you want to get better at bench press technique, rather than focusing on, say, activating your triceps, if you focus on a cue like pulling the bar apart, you'll get a better result. So takeaways. The first one is, if we're going to focus on the mind-muscle connection, we might want to focus on the earlier part of our set, the first few repetitions, because as we start to fatigue, it's not really going to matter anymore, perhaps. The second one is, make sure that you're doing this with the appropriate loads. If you're doing lower intensity loading, 20 to 60% of 1 RM, this is going to be more helpful. You'll be able to focus on this internal cue. But if you exceed that 60% of 1 rep max, the data says you're not going to really do a good job of driving that neural signal beyond what naturally is happening just by the way of increased load itself. And the third one is, keep in mind, if we're working on technique here, that may actually limit you if you focus on the mind-muscle connection. Whereas an external cue, focusing on an external object like the bar, that might be a better tool if you're trying to actually improve your performance at that specific task. I hope this was helpful.